April 18, 1943. 7:30 hours. Location: 500 feet above the glassy surface of the Solomon Sea. The cockpit of the P-38G Lightning is a cramped, vibrating glass bubble. For Captain Thomas Lanphier and the 17 other pilots of the 339th Fighter Squadron, the world has been reduced to the rhythmic thrum of twin Allison engines and the endless, shimmering blue of the Pacific. They are flying low, so low that salt spray occasionally flecks their windscreens to stay beneath the reach of Japanese radar. They are 400 miles from their base at Guadalcanal, operating at the absolute bleeding edge of their fuel gauges. To the Japanese High Command, this flight is a physical impossibility. To the Americans, it is a desperate gamble. In the distance, two Mitsubishi G-4M Betty bombers, flanked by Zeros, emerge as tiny specks against the morning haze over Bougainville. Inside the lead bomber sits the man who planned Pearl Harbor. The Americans are not here for a dogfight. They are here for an execution. The clocks in the cockpits tick toward 9:34. History is about to be rewritten by a burst of .50 caliber rounds. The early months of 1943 found the Pacific theater in a state of agonizing transition. The bloody, mud-clogged struggle for Guadalcanal had finally drawn to a close in February, leaving the Imperial Japanese Army shaken and the United States Marines exhausted but victorious. For the first time since the devastating surprise at Pearl Harbor, the Japanese juggernaut had been checked. Yet, the victory was localized. To the north, the massive Japanese stronghold at Rabaul remained a Gibraltar of the Pacific, a sprawling complex of airfields and naval anchorages that projected lethal power across the Solomon Islands. From this fortress, the Imperial Japanese Navy, IJN, continued to funnel reinforcements and launch devastating air raids, stalling the Allied, island-hopping strategy before it could truly gain momentum. The psychological landscape was even more complex than the physical one. For the United States, the memory of December 7th, 1941, was not a fading scar but a pulsing wound. The man perceived as the architect of that wound was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet. Yamamoto was more than a military strategist. He was a titan of Japanese morale and a Harvard-educated visionary who understood the industrial might of America better than any of his peers. He had predicted that Japan could run wild for 6 months to a year, but after that, the sleeping giant would rise. By 1943, his prophecy was coming true, and the admiral knew it. He was a man burdened by the weight of a war he had known would be difficult to win. Yet he remained the glue holding the IJN's fractured command structure together. In the spring of 1943, Yamamoto sought to bolster the flagging spirits of his frontline troops. He initiated Operation Igo, a massive aerial offensive designed to suppress Allied air power in the Solomons and New Guinea. While the operation claimed exaggerated successes in Japanese reports, the reality was a grinding war of attrition that Japan could ill afford. Yamamoto decided that a personal inspection tour of the forward bases in the Upper Solomons, specifically Balhail, Shortland, and Bin, was necessary to steady the nerves of his commanders. It was a gesture of leadership, a calculated risk intended to show the men in the trenches that the high command stood with them. However, the Japanese leadership operated under a fatal assumption: the absolute sanctity of their communications. They believed their Type 97 Jade, Cipher, and the refined Jan 25 naval codes were unbreakable. This hubris formed a silent, invisible trap. Across the Pacific, in windowless rooms in Hawaii and Washington, D.C., a secretive group of linguists and cryptanalysts known as HYPO and NIGIT were proving them wrong. These codebreakers were part of the magic intercepts, and they were about to stumble upon the most significant itinerary of the war. On April 14, 1943, a high-priority message encoded in the Jan 25D naval cipher pulsed through the airwaves, intercepted by Allied listening posts from the Aleutians to Australia. When the decrypted text reached the desk of the intelligence officers at FRUPAC, Fleet Radio Unit, Pacific, in Pearl Harbor, the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The message was a detailed itinerary, a minute-by-minute schedule for Admiral Yamamoto's upcoming inspection tour. It specified departure times, arrival locations, and even the exact number of transport planes and escorting fighters. To the codebreakers, it was almost too perfect. It was a roadmap to the most wanted man in the Pacific. The intelligence was rushed to Admiral Chester Nimitz. The decision before him was fraught with strategic and ethical peril. In the world of high-stakes espionage, acting on such precise intelligence risked alerting the Japanese that their unbreakable codes had been compromised. If the Japanese changed their encryption, the United States would be plunged back into the dark, losing the magic that had already won them the Battle of Midway. Furthermore, the concept of a targeted assassination of a high-ranking military leader was a controversial departure from traditional naval warfare. Nimitz weighed the risk against the potential reward. The removal of Japan's greatest strategic mind and the devastating blow it would deal to the Japanese national psyche. After consulting with the White House and receiving a subtle but clear green light from President Franklin D. Roosevelt, the mission was authorized. It was dubbed Operation Vengeance. The task of planning the strike fell to Admiral Mark Mitscher, but the logistical hurdles were immense. The target was Bougainville, nearly 400 miles away from the nearest American airbase at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. Most American fighters, like the F-4F Wildcat or the F-4U Corsair, lacked the range to fly that distance, engage in a dogfight, and return home. The mission required a specialized machine, a twin-engine Predator that could carry massive external fuel tanks and maintain high speeds over long distances. The only aircraft in the theater capable of meeting these requirements was the Lockheed P-38G Lightning. Known by the Luftwaffe as the fork-tailed devil, the P-38 was a marvel of late 1930s engineering, featuring two powerful engines and a concentrated battery of 4.50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon in the nose. However, even for the Lightning, this was a suicide range. To make the interception work, the pilots would have to fly a circuitous 600-mile dogleg route over the open ocean to avoid being spotted by Japanese coast watchers. They would have to arrive at a precise point in space at a precise second in time, without the use of radio communication or modern navigation. The margin for error was zero. The first angle of Operation Vengeance is a tactical and technological one, centered on the unique silhouette of the Lockheed P-38G Lightning. In 1943, most fighter aircraft were single-engine machines designed for short-range scrambles or carrier deck takeoffs. The P-38 was different, a radical departure from convention. Its twin-boom design and tricycle landing gear made it a stable gun platform, but it was its endurance that made it a legend. To achieve the 600-mile circuitous route required to intercept Yamamoto, the 339th Fighter Squadron had to turn their fighters into flying fuel depots. Technicians at Henderson Field worked through the night to fit the Lightnings with oversized 165-gallon and 310-gallon drop tanks. These massive external reservoirs were aerodynamic nightmares, but they provided the lifeblood for a mission that pushed the laws of physics. The pilots were essentially sitting atop thousands of pounds of highly flammable aviation spirit, flying a route that left no room for mechanical failure. If an engine sputtered over the shark-infested waters of the Solomon Sea, there would be no rescue. The second angle is the human and psychological burden placed on the pilots. Major John Mitchell, the mission leader, was tasked with a feat of navigation that remains one of the most impressive in aviation history. Without the aid of GPS, radar, or radio contact, Mitchell had to guide 18 planes across hundreds of miles of featureless ocean using only a compass, a clock, and his knowledge of wind drift. He chose to fly at a mere 30 feet above the waves to evade Japanese radar, a grueling physical task that required constant, minute corrections to avoid clipping a swell and disintegrating. The pilots were gripped by a singular tension, the fear of being seen. Every Japanese fishing boat or lonely outpost was a potential alarm that could end the mission before it began. They weren't just flying a plane, they were navigating a needle through a haystack while holding their breath. This wasn't just a military operation. It was a high-stakes hunt where the hunters were as vulnerable as the prey. The third angle focuses on the enemy's perspective and the fatal flaw of Japanese discipline. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was a man of legendary punctuality. His staff officers knew that a schedule set by the admiral was a sacred contract. On the morning of April 18th, despite warnings from local commanders at Rabaul that the flight was risky and that Allied activity in the area was increasing, Yamamoto refused to cancel or even delay his departure. He viewed any deviation from the plan as a sign of cowardice or a failure of the Bushido spirit. This rigid adherence to routine was his Achilles heel. The Japanese believed so fervently in the security of their codes and the superiority of their position that they failed to consider the possibility of a surgical strike. To them, the Americans were a blunt instrument, capable of massive naval battles, but not the finesse required for a long-range assassination. Yamamoto's plane took off at 6:05, exactly on schedule, effectively sealing his fate by his own commitment to order. The final angle is the moral and strategic weight of the decision made in the corridors of power. This was not a typical combat engagement. It was the targeted killing of a specific individual, an act that bordered on what some at the time considered assassination rather than warfare. In Washington and Pearl Harbor, leaders had to weigh the benefits of killing Yamamoto against the possibility of he being replaced by someone even more capable, or the risk that his death would turn him into a martyr, galvanizing the Japanese people for a fight to the absolute end. Furthermore, there was the double-edged sword of intelligence. If the mission succeeded too perfectly, the Japanese would know their codes were compromised. To prevent this, the Americans had to concoct an elaborate cover story involving sightings by coast watchers and accidental patrols, a layer of deception that added to the psychological complexity of the operation. This was the birth of modern high-value targeting, a shift in the philosophy of war that prioritized the removal of key individuals over the destruction of entire armies. The P-38s, meanwhile, were now entering the final leg of their journey, their fuel tanks lighter, but their pilots' adrenaline reaching a breaking point as the green silhouette of Bougainville rose from the horizon. At 9:30 hours, the 18 P-38 Lightnings of the killer flight and cover flight reached the coast of Bougainville. Major John Mitchell's navigation had been flawless. After nearly 2 hours of flying just feet above the Whitecaps, navigating solely by dead reckoning and a stopwatch, the Americans pulled into a steep climb. They shed their massive, empty auxiliary fuel tanks, which tumbled like silver teardrops into the sea. Now light and lethal, the pilots scanned the horizon. The sky was clear, the tropical sun beating down on the jungle canopy below. Then, at 9:33, a voice crackled through the forbidden silence of the radio. The first words spoken since they had left Guadalcanal. Bogies. 11 o'clock high. 2 Mitsubishi G-4M Betty bombers, painted in dark jungle green, were cruising at 4,500 feet, beginning their descent toward the Kahili airfield. They were flanked by 6 A-6M0s, flying in a tight defensive V formation. The Japanese were completely unaware. The P-38s had arrived not just on the right day, but within 60 seconds of their projected intercept time. Major Mitchell ordered the cover flight to climb to 18,000 feet to pin down the Zero escorts, while the designated attack group, led by Captain Thomas Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber, veered toward the bombers. The Japanese pilots, seeing the twin-tailed silhouettes dive from the sun, were momentarily paralyzed by the impossibility of the sight. No American fighter should have had the range to be here. The engagement was instantaneous and violent. As the Zeros peeled off to intercept, the 2 Betty bombers dived toward the safety of the trees, their pilots pushing the throttles to the firewall. Lanphier and Barber pursued, the P-38's superior speed closing the gap in seconds. Lanphier engaged the escorting Zeros to clear a path, while Rex Barber locked onto the lead bomber, the plane carrying Admiral Yamamoto. Barber's nose-mounted cannons erupted, a stream of 20mm shells and .50 caliber rounds chewing into the bomber's right engine and tail assembly. The Betty bomber began to shed debris, its metal skin peeling away under the concentrated fire. The bomber shuddered, its right wing erupting in a geyser of orange flame. It banked sharply to the left, losing altitude as it skimmed the tops of the mahogany trees. Inside the cockpit, the Japanese crew fought the controls, but the aircraft was a dying beast. Behind it, the second bomber, carrying Yamamoto's chief of staff, Vice Admiral Matome Agaki, veered toward the ocean, desperately trying to evade the relentless American pursuit. The precision of the magic intercept was being translated into raw, kinetic destruction in the skies over the Solomon Islands. The jungle of Bougainville rushed up to meet the lead bomber. Rex Barber, refusing to break off his attack, continued to pour fire into the stricken G4M. The aircraft, now a torch of aviation fuel and magnesium, clipped the tallest trees and cartwheeled into the dense undergrowth. A massive plume of black smoke erupted from the canopy, marking the spot where Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's journey ended. He was still strapped into his seat, his hand allegedly clutching the hilt of his katana, as the wreckage settled into the steaming mud of the Solomon Islands. Simultaneously, the second bomber was fighting a losing battle for survival. Attacked by Lieutenant Besby Holmes and Raymond Hine, the transport plane carrying Admiral Agaki dived toward the coastline, hoping the low altitude would prevent the P-38s from getting underneath them. It was a futile maneuver. The Lightnings dived from the flank, their heavy nose armament shredding the bomber's fuselage. The plane skipped across the surface of the water like a stone before plunging into the sea just offshore. Agaki, though badly injured, would be one of the few survivors pulled from the wreckage by Japanese rescue parties, but the man he served was gone. The sky over Bougainville became a chaotic swirl of dogfights. The 6 Japanese Zeros, realizing the gravity of their failure, fought with a desperate, suicidal ferocity. They swarmed the P-38s, trying to prevent their escape. Raymond Hine's Lightning was seen trailing smoke, disappearing into the clouds. He would never return to Guadalcanal. The remaining American pilots, their mission accomplished and their fuel warnings glowing red on their instrument panels, dived back toward the sea. They couldn't afford a prolonged engagement. Every second spent in a turn was a gallon of fuel they didn't have for the 400-mile return trip. As the Americans leveled out at 20 feet above the water, the radio silence was finally shattered. Captain Lanphier, fueled by adrenaline and the knowledge of what they had just achieved, keyed his mic. That son of a bitch will not be dictating any peace terms in the White House. The flight back was a grueling test of endurance. Pilots leaned their engines to the point of stalling, watching their gauges with predatory intensity. When the first P-38s finally touched down at Henderson Field, their engines sputtered and died almost as soon as they cleared the runway. They had returned with mere cups of fuel remaining in their tanks. The impossible flight was over, and the master of the Japanese Navy was dead in the dirt of a tropical island. The silence that followed the crash in the Bougainville jungle was heavy and suffocating. For the Japanese forces at the nearby Kahili airfield, the sight of the black smoke rising from the trees was an omen they refused to name. A search party, led by Army Engineer Lieutenant Tsuyoshi Hamasuna, hacked through the dense, vine-choked undergrowth for over 24 hours before they reached the site. What they found was a scene of clinical devastation. The Betty bomber had been torn apart by the impact, its wings sheared off, and its fuselage charred. Amidst the twisted aluminum and the smell of burnt rubber, they found Admiral Yamamoto. He had been thrown from the wreckage, still seated in his chair under a mahogany tree. His gloved hand rested on his sword, and his head was slumped forward. To the searchers, he looked as if he were merely asleep, but the 2 bullet holes, one in his shoulder and one in his jaw, told a different story. The Japanese military immediately went into a state of shocked mourning, but also deep paranoia. The loss was a catastrophic blow to the Imperial Navy's command structure. Yamamoto was not just a commander. He was the primary architect of their naval strategy. His death left a vacuum that no other officer could truly fill. However, the immediate concern for the high command was how the Americans had found him. The Japanese conducted a rigorous internal investigation into the security of their communications. Yet, In an act of monumental institutional blindness, they concluded that it was impossible for their codes to have been broken. They instead blamed a leak from a local base or a chance sighting by an American scout plane. This failure to recognize the truth meant they continued to use the compromised Gen 25 system, allowing the Allies to maintain their magic advantage for the remainder of the war. In the United States, the news was handled with extreme delicacy. While the pilots returned to Guadalcanal as heroes, the military top brass was terrified that the public celebration of Yamamoto's death would alert Tokyo to the code-breaking success. The official report was buried. Intelligence officers debriefed the pilots under strict oaths of secrecy, and the mission was publicly attributed to information from Coast Watchers. Even as the American public eventually learned of the Admiral's death, the true mechanics of the mission, the intercepted schedule, and the 600-mile precision flight, remained one of the most closely guarded secrets of World War II. The impossible flight had succeeded not only in killing the Admiral, but in maintaining the veil of silence over the source of the kill. The official announcement of Yamamoto's death was withheld from the Japanese public for more than a month, finally broadcast on May 21, 1943. The news struck the nation like a second Midway. Yamamoto was granted a state funeral of unprecedented scale, with his ashes divided between his home in Nagaoka and the Thomas Cemetery in Tokyo. More than 1 million people lined the streets in silent grief, watching the caisson pass. But behind the ceremonial mourning, the Imperial Japanese Navy was beginning to fracture. Yamamoto had been the only figure with enough prestige to bridge the bitter rivalry between the Army and the Navy. With his passing, the coordination of the Japanese war effort began to unravel, replaced by infighting and a lack of coherent long-term vision. Strategically, the loss of Yamamoto accelerated the decline of Japanese naval aviation. His successor, Admiral Manichi Koga, was a capable officer, but he lacked Yamamoto's charisma and his intuitive understanding of carrier warfare. Under Koga, the IJN shifted to a more defensive posture, abandoning the aggressive, forward-leaning strikes that had characterized the early war. This gave the United States the breathing room it needed to finish building its two-ocean navy. By the time the Japanese attempted to re-engage in a major fleet action, the industrial might of America had produced a swarm of Essex-class carriers and thousands of Hellcat fighters, making a Japanese victory mathematically impossible. For the 339th Fighter Squadron, the aftermath was bittersweet. The mission had been a resounding success, but it triggered a decades-long controversy over who actually fired the fatal shots. Captain Thomas Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber both claimed credit for the kill. The confusion of a high-speed dogfight at treetop level made it impossible to be certain, and the Air Force initially split the credit between them. This dispute would simmer for 50 years, highlighting the intense pressure and the fog of war that defined the mission. Despite the internal bickering, the tactical reality remained unchanged. The P-38 had proven it was the most versatile fighter in the Pacific, capable of reaching out across the horizon to strike the heart of the enemy. The wreckage of the Green Bomber remained where it fell, slowly being reclaimed by the jungle of Bougainville. It stood as a silent monument to the day the impossible range of American air power became a terrifying reality for the Japanese Empire. The stunning 2,000-mile round-trip capability, when considering the circuitous route and loiter time, had not just killed a man, it had signaled the end of Japanese territorial security. No matter how deep into the Solomon Islands they retreated, they were no longer out of reach. The interception of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto remains one of the most clinical and consequential missions in the history of aerial warfare. It was a moment where the cold, mathematical precision of code-breaking met the raw, physical grit of the cockpit. In the grand arc of World War II, Operation Vengeance served as a definitive signal that the sleeping giant had not only awakened, but had developed a reach that defied the traditional boundaries of the Pacific map. The mission was a synthesis of three distinct American strengths: the invisible brilliance of the cryptanalysts, The industrial ingenuity of Lockheed's engineering and the sheer audacity of pilots who were willing to stake their lives on a stopwatch and a compass. By flying a distance the Japanese deemed impossible, the United States didn't just remove a brilliant strategist, they shattered the Japanese sense of sanctuary. The realization that even their highest commander could be plucked from the sky over his own territory created a psychological tremor that reached from the foxholes of Bougainville to the Imperial Palace in Tokyo. Yet, beyond the tactical victory, the mission leaves a haunting legacy regarding the nature of modern war. It was an early ancestor to the surgical strikes of the 21st century, a shift from the attrition of armies to the targeting of individuals. It proved that in the age of information, a single decrypted sentence could be as lethal as a carrier group. Today, the rusted remains of the Betty bomber still lie in the damp soil of the Bougainville jungle, surrounded by the silence of the mahogany trees. It is a grim relic of a morning in 1943 when the sky turned into a trap. For the men who flew the P-38s, the mission was a singular point in their lives where time, technology, and duty converged. For the world, it was the moment the Pacific War lost its primary architect, and the tide, which had been turning for months, finally became an unstoppable flood.